Testing. There we go. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's session. Today's topic is going to be on migrating to Jamf Pro, specifically from Kandji. So those of you that are familiar with that competitor to Jamf, we have Aiden from Abnormal Security who's going to be joining us. We have no shortage of competition at this year's JNUC, so I'm very excited to hear from this. So let's bring on Aiden onto the stage.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for coming to my talk today. This is the first time I've presented at JNUC. It's the first time I've actually been to JNUC as well, so thank you. I am still quite jet-lagged. You can probably tell from my accent that I'm from England, so if I go a bit slow, forgive me. So my name's Aiden. I work for a company called Abnormal Security. But I'll talk more about them in a second. First, I've got a little icebreaker for you. This is my cat. I'm a cat dad. Her name's Clara. She's named after the 11th Doctor Who companion, Clara Oswald. Fun facts, as you can see, she can operate a washing machine. She looks good even with a cone on her head. And yes, that is an air tag on her collar. So a little bit about me and my career history. So I started off working at Apple in 2014, not Apple corporate, Apple retail. I started there as a technical specialist. In 2016, I was promoted to Genius whilst I was there. Then in 2018, I moved over to Twitter, not X, Twitter. I was an IT support engineer there. Then a senior IT support engineer, and then a client platform engineer. Then I moved over to Abnormal Security, where I work today. Started off there as an IT engineer, and am now a client platform engineer. So a little bit about Abnormal Security and what they do. So they use AI to protect against attacks that exploit human behavior, such as phishing, social engineering, account takeovers. The product started with protecting against email attacks, but we now protect against a growing list of SaaS applications as well. Got over 2,000 customers now, including 15% of the Fortune 500. I think it's actually closer to 20% now. But what do I do at Abnormal Security? Obviously, I work in IT. When I started there, it was primarily just supporting our end users. More of kind of like a jack of all trades. But with my experience from Twitter, I quickly got involved in device management, which leads us to the reason why I'm doing this talk today. Migrating to Jamf Pro. So this was one of the major tasks that I was given. We were a Kandji shop, and our leadership decided on moving to Jamf Pro. And so, yeah, I was tasked with doing that. So this is the agenda. So I'll be talking about why we migrated, why we chose Jamf, how I did it, and the lessons learned along the way. So why migrate to Jamf in the first place? Why did we leave Kandji? First of all, scalability. So when I started at Abnormal Security, we had about 500 Mac users. That grew to about 550 by the time we decided to make the move. And if you're not familiar with Kandji, they use something called blueprints to manage their devices. And it's not really the same thing that Jamf announced on Monday, it seems. Blueprints in Kandji is essentially how you configure everything. And that works out if you're a company of about a dozen or a few dozen users. The idea of it being that you can have your several departments like engineering, marketing, et cetera, and you can deploy completely different sets of configurations for all those different sets of users. But we were in the several hundreds of users, and so it ended up into this situation where it was a mess. It was like mitosis. We had, I think, when I started looking at moving us, a few dozen blueprints, because if we wanted to, say, have a separate bunch of apps or configuration profiles for a separate bunch of users, there was no way to go into a blueprint and say, well, I just want to do it for these users. I don't want to do it for everyone. So what we would have to do is duplicate a blueprint and then have all of those different settings for those different users. So flexibility, that kind of ties into scalability. The two kind of go hand in hand with one another. I'll give you a good example. I was tasked, when we were still using Kandji, I was tasked with getting users to sign out of their iCloud accounts that were signed in. We essentially wanted to lock it down so that people couldn't sign into iCloud, for better or for worse. For what it's worth, we're not doing that today. We're just blocking iCloud Drive because that's really what we care about. But that's a topic for another day. What I just decided to do at the time, there is a key in a payload that you can use to block internet accounts entirely. That's not the route that I wanted to go down, because then you wouldn't be able to sign into internet accounts at all on macOS, not just iCloud. So the route that I went down was using the keys and payloads to block specific preference panes. Keys which I think are now deprecated. They were originally intended for system preferences, and they did work once it switched over to system settings for a little while. That's the route I was going down. So I was trying to block the Apple ID pane, and I was trying to block the internet accounts pane, and some apps that I think allow you to sign into iCloud as well. But the problem in Kandji was that there was no way for me to do that dynamically, because of course I couldn't just block the preference panes for everyone, because then anyone that's already signed into iCloud can't sign out, and that's something that we would want to try and do, stop people signing in that are not signed in, and then sign everyone out that is already signed in. So what we had to do was, ironically, the way that we were able to discover who was signed into iCloud was using what Kandji call parameters, which is essentially their kind of out-of-the-box extension attributes, akin to extension attributes in Jamf. But you couldn't create your own. You only had the parameters that you could work with that Kandji gave you. And what we ended up having to do was take that list of people signed into iCloud and then create a static list in Kandji and essentially create a separate blueprint to block those preference panes for those users. Then when people signed out, we were relying on us as support engineers to then move them to the blueprint manually. So as you can probably imagine, that didn't work out very well, because you're relying on a human there to do all of the hard parts, when really it would be better if we could just dynamically apply it to the people that were signed in. But the iCloud parameter in Kandji couldn't be used as a criteria for like a smart group. Smart groups didn't exist in Kandji, at least not whilst we were using it. I think they're trying to get there, but so as you can imagine, it made things very, very difficult. Integrability, which I discovered is a word. I thought it would be integratability, but it's integrability. Kandji had, whilst we were using them, a handful of apps that you could natively integrate with Kandji. Jamf, on the other hand, have the Jamf Marketplace, and a lot of flexibility in how you can integrate things like open source tools into Jamf. And then lastly, the cost, which is probably one of the big things, especially for my leadership, that was important. Kandji decided to ramp their prices up quite significantly. I think it was around 40%. And it made the difference between Kandji and Jamf in terms of cost quite slim, which kind of really drove us towards that decision as well. So why choose Jamf? Well, all of the reasons that I've mentioned previously. Smart groups, for me, is just a massive one. It seems crazy to me that an MDM wouldn't have smart groups and extension attributes to go along with it. Those two alone, in my opinion, are one of the most powerful things about using an MDM like Jamf. It just gives you so much flexibility to apply things dynamically to different users. The Jamf marketplace. Jamf's been around for a long time. They're one of the oldest in the game. The Jamf API is probably a big one. It's very extensive. I've barely scratched the surface myself on how we could use that. Kandji had an API, but honestly, I didn't find it very useful. There was some reports that I could make, but outside of that, it wasn't really much in terms of how I could integrate with it. Jamf training. So part of the deal when we bought Jamf was that I got a training pass as well. So I've gone through all of the courses. I'm happy to say that I passed Jamf 400 recently, so got my badge for that yesterday. But of course, Jamf training, you can't really get all of that done on day one. That's more of a long-term thing, unless you're going to try and get it all done before you actually buy Jamf. That's more of kind of a forward-thinking approach. And that's really where the Jamf training catalog really came in handy for me. I didn't have any previous experience with Jamf before I started the migration in November last year. At Twitter, we used VMware Workspace ONE whilst I was in CPE. And of course, we were using Kandji abnormal security. So the training catalog really helped me fill in the gaps. It's at trainingcatalog.jamf.com compared to the Jamf instructor-led training, which is at account.jamf.com. You've got topics on all of the different products that Jamf used, so I just essentially went through all of the Jamf Pro ones, and it really got me up to speed. Jamf professional services as well. So when we decided to move to Jamf, that was one of the things that we could look into. So we got an onboarding session with them to essentially check our environment and make sure that it was all up to standard. And then additionally, if we wanted to, we could have some time with Jamf professional services to kind of go over any niggling issues that we had, something that was quite complicated that we didn't necessarily want to go back and forth with Jamf support on. And Jamf Migrate as well, which is Jamf's bespoke tool to migrate from your previous MDM to your new one. So this is a product that Jamf professional services make, and they tailor it to your environment. So that was super handy, made the process a lot simpler than it probably otherwise would have been. So how did I do it? Well, first of all, what I needed to do, and by the way, this image that you can see, you're not meant to be able to read it. It's just to give you an idea of the kind of scale of it. But I'll come back to that in a second. So it started off with blueprints I've mentioned already. Kandji have something called library items, which is essentially anything that you want to put in a blueprint, configuration profiles, third-party apps, etc. Essentially, what you're looking at here is a map of all of the blueprints we had and all of the library items that we had in Kandji and how they related to one another. So my first task was kind of narrowing those down, looking at the library items, getting rid of any that we didn't use anymore, looking at the blueprints, trying to consolidate them down into a smaller number so it was just easier to work with, seeing where I could use assignment rules. That was a feature that Jamf introduced whilst we were using them, which was kind of the beginnings, I think, of smart groups. You could apply settings to serial numbers, for example, within a blueprint. And there was some criteria you could use, like macOS version, you could scope to that. But that, along with maybe a dozen more, was kind of the limits of that. So that's what the orange is. The orange is where, yes, that library item is in the blueprint, but it's within an assignment rule within that blueprint. And so that's what you're looking at here. The green is the x-axis is the blueprints, the y-axis is the library items, and the green is, yes, it's in there. The orange is, it's kind of in there. And then it was just a case of the white column that you can see was me essentially going through researching the equivalent feature in Jamf, which again is where the Jamf training catalog came in handy, and then just listing out, how do I build this out in Jamf? Then the very last column you can see is essentially me just going through and saying, yep, I've built that out now, yep, I've built that out now, until eventually I got to the bottom and had my Jamf environment as close to the Kandji environment as I could. That's just a kind of a close-up, just so you can see it a bit better. And then it was just a case of migrating everyone. So I obviously tested the process out on myself first, wrote up PDF documentation for it, tested on a few of my peers, tested on the IT team, and then tested on some small pilot groups and kind of refined the documentation that I had until I got it into a place that I was happy with. Then it was a case of rolling out into groups across the company, starting with small regional groups and moving out to larger groups. The company I work for is mostly based in the US, in the West Coast in particular. So I started off by doing it with EMEA and APAC, and then East Coast, and working my way along that way so that the process was more refined as we got outside of time zones that I wasn't working in. So lessons learned along the way. So I've got some bullet points here. If there's anyone here that happens to be a Kandji customer and is thinking of moving to Jamf, then you're my ideal audience member. Here's the things that you should watch out for. So we've got Jamf Migrate payload keys, Wi-Fi profiles, File Vault keyboard, App Store apps, and Apple MDM migration bug. So Jamf Migrate payload keys. So one of the things that I wasn't really aware of until I asked for it was that the Jamf Migrate tool did have a whole bunch of keys that you could use to customize the experience. I did mention to Jamf Professional Services it would probably be a good idea to kind of advertise those more, but this is something to be aware of. So for example, we customized the icon so it was branded, so it could be more easily trusted. There's a part of the process during the migration where the user has to enter their password to re-escrow the File Vault recovery key. And the default timeout for that process is 1 minute. And what we found is that for us, that wasn't long enough. As a lot of you will probably be familiar with, profiles come down via APNS and the Apple framework, and that's not always reliable. It's not always instantaneous, even though it should be. So we found that changing this timeout to 5 minutes worked out a lot better for us. That gave the new File Vault payload a good chance to come down so that the re-escrow was successful rather than failing. It wasn't an issue if the re-escrowing of a File Vault recovery key did fail, because it's not integral to the process of migrating. It just means that you wouldn't have the recovery key escrowed in Jamf. So it's not the end of the world, but still better something to account for if you can. And same with the timeout for the whole process finishing. So once the user gets to the end of the process, the default timeout again was 1 minute. And that meant that some users that got to the end of the process then didn't realize that it had finished because the window just disappeared and gracefully closed itself. So that we changed to 10 minutes. We found that was a good kind of middle ground for people to see it, but also just not leave it as a running process. Wi-Fi profiles. So something that you should be aware of if you're removing an MDM profile as part of a migration is that's obviously going to include your profiles for deploying Wi-Fi for people that you have might be working in offices. We're a remote first company, so it wasn't too much of an issue for us, but we definitely had to add that to the documentation to make sure that people disconnected from that Wi-Fi and connected to the guest Wi-Fi so that they didn't just lose internet halfway through the process. File Vault keyboard, bit of a weird one, but we discovered that some people were saying, hey, I'm definitely entering my password correctly, but it's saying that it's failing. And Jamf Migrate was configured to only allow users to enter it 3 times, after which it would fail to stop the process getting stuck. We had one particularly savvy user who managed to figure out that if he entered the password as if he had a US keyboard layout, because he was actually based in the UK and had a UK keyboard layout, that the password would then work. I won't admit that I fully understand exactly the reason for that, but my understanding is that FileVault doesn't always use the same keyboard layout as the system. Sometimes it can default to the US keyboard layout. So just something to be aware of. If your users are saying that their password isn't working and they happen not to be using a US keyboard layout, get them to try a US keyboard layout. VPP apps. This was a fun one. So something that I discovered the hard way is that during testing, some users in the test groups were reporting that when they had migrated, that some of their apps just disappeared. And what we discovered was that in Kandji, we had a bunch of apps deployed via VPP. And what that meant was that when the MDM profile for Kandji was removed, those apps deployed via VPP, the license was revoked, and so those apps were removed as well. So what I ended up having to do was create a script that I could deploy in Kandji in advance of the migration that would look for the presence of these apps and then log them in a file that was stored locally. Then what I would do is, once the user had migrated over to Jamf, have a sister script, for lack of a better expression, to look for the presence of those files and then reinstall those apps if they were there. So that, for us, that was Slack, and that was the Microsoft Office 365 apps. Slack for us was a core app. Everyone had to have it installed, so that we didn't have to worry about. We just installed it once they got to Jamf if it wasn't already there. But the Office 365 apps, because we're a Google Workspace shop, Office 365 apps were only installed if people specifically requested it. So we definitely didn't want to go just installing that for everyone, because that would have incurred the company an extra cost that we didn't want to necessarily advertise. And that's why I created this script. So the script would run once daily on Macs, still on Kandji, and if it found the app, it would record it. And also, if the app was there before, but then it had been removed, maybe the user decided they didn't want to use it anymore, it would also then go and readjust that value in the file as well. And I would just like to give a shout out to my friend and ex-colleague, Wilson, for giving me the idea for writing the script. And the last one, Apple MDM migration bug. So this was quite a weird one. It affected about 3% of our users that migrated. But essentially, just to give you kind of a bit of background first, for those that aren't aware, in terms of managing Macs, you have, with Jamf at least, two different frameworks for that. You've got the Apple framework that installs the MDM profile, installs all of the other profiles, allows you to send MDM commands, deploy apps if you're doing it via MDM commands. And then the Jamf framework essentially fills in all of the gaps in terms of Mac management that the Apple framework can't account for. For example, if you want to deploy and run a script, you can't really do that with the Apple MDM framework. So that's why Jamf installs the Jamf binary, which does regular check-ins every 15 minutes by default, and then we'll check for policies that you have and run those policies. What we found in 3% of cases is that Jamf migrate would go through the process, green ticks all the way through, but then when we looked afterwards, there were no profiles on the machine. There was no Jamf profiles, and even though the process seemed to have, maybe those profiles were installed and they were removed, maybe they were never installed and Jamf migrate thought they were, we spoke to Jamf support about it, and they said that this was an Apple bug specifically, which I can believe, to be honest. But it was easy enough to find these users because the Jamf framework would always be installed without fail during Jamf migrate. So we had a device record of these Macs, and I was able to create a smart group that would be able to pick these users out, and we could follow up with them. Also, they would often let us know that was the case because we use Okta as our identity management, and we deploy a SCEP profile in order for the device to be attested by Okta. And because that profile wouldn't have been there, that user wouldn't be able to access any of our services. So they would often raise the flag sometimes before we even reach out to them. And once we identified those users, it was a simple enough process to get them back. We had to get them to do it themselves because of the nature of Apple enrollment. But it was just a case of running sudo profiles dash type enrollment to renew dash type enrollment to get them re-enrolled and follow the process. And that's all of the shortcomings as well. So that is my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aiden. I appreciate you taking us through that migration path. So we'll have some time for questions here. I see one over here. I'm going to walk over. As you ask your question, just try to be loud and clear so everybody in the room can hear you. But I'm coming over to you now.
Did you guys migrate Apple Business Manager first? Or were you using Apple Business Manager in both?
Yeah, that's a good point. So yeah, so what we essentially did was we got Jamf in Apple Business Manager alongside Kandji, and then when we were ready to migrate, we just moved all of the Macs in Apple Business Manager over to the other MDM server in bulk. Because the good thing about that setting in ABM is it only applies during setup assistant, i.e. when the Mac's going to be migrating, or for new users during that first setup phase. Which is another good point to mention as well, is there was kind of a cutoff point where we were happy with the setup in Jamf and we were ready to migrate people and make Jamf the default enrollment for new users rather than Kandji as well. So.
Hi, how are you? So we are moving away from Kandji and we are on Jamf Pro. We talk to the engineers and stuff. But my question was, when you have like a mindset with Kandji, with blueprints, and then you're talking with engineers, and if they don't know what Kandji is, how do you tell them this is what I want? I mean, like going from blueprints and then to configurations, it's sort of like, and I mean, it's amazing. You can be very granular, and I didn't know you could be that. So what was your best in like grasping it, around, wrapping your brain around that? Does that make sense?
So are you asking like how to kind of get the other engineers in IT on board, or just more around I have a fairly good grasp with how Kandji works. Blueprints it's so easy to work around, but then trying to replicate that and then tell them this is what you do, it's sort of like, if they're not familiar with it, you're sort of like, well, you have to do configurations. And I didn't know what configurations were and how to start with it, and then maneuvering within the dashboard and stuff. So it was some type of work to get to it, but I'm there almost like 99% with it. So. Yeah, I guess it depends on your environment. See, we, for the most part, we had the same settings deployed to everyone in the company. Things like making sure that the screen timed out after 10 minutes in order to get the password to prompt. Things like having file vault on. In Kandji, what I found using blueprints is that a lot of these blueprints had like most of the same settings. It was just, there was some things that we wanted different for some users, etc. So I definitely, like moving to Jamf, I definitely wouldn't try and replicate blueprints. I mean, you wouldn't be able to in Jamf Pro at least anyway. But yeah, in my case, it was a case of here's all the settings that I want to deploy to everyone, because Jamf, it just works with scoping rather than blueprints, because blueprints essentially just a different scope for every blueprint. And then having the things that maybe I just want for IT or et cetera, as configuration profiles. So in Jamf, you have categories, so you can categorize things. So if you want to, you can have all your configuration profiles for all of your Macs in one category if you wanted to, and then you could have other categories that would just visually separate it out to make it a bit easier to digest as a Jamf Pro user.
We're like sort of in the process of onboarding. So is Jamf Migrate, is that a tool or is that a process? What is it?
Yeah, so it's a tool that Jamf Professional Services offer, and it just simplifies the migration process rather than you having to create a custom script yourself that's going to remove the MDM profile and enroll in Jamf's using Kandji APIs and Jamf APIs, re-escrowing the key and all that stuff. This tool does all of that for you so that you don't have to worry about doing that. Or if you didn't script it, you'd have to ask the user you'd have to unmanage them in Kandji, then you'd have to ask the user to essentially go through the enrollment process as if they're a new user, short of erasing the Mac. And depending on how many, if you've got like maybe 10 users, you could probably just do that and not use Jamf.
That's what we're probably going to do.
Yeah, you could probably not use Jamf Migrate if you're in the hundreds.
Cleaner and safer.
Yeah, you might not need to necessarily get Jamf Migrate. If you're in the hundreds of employees, then Jamf Migrate is definitely going to be very useful.
Yeah, I'm really excited with the product. So.
Hi, and thanks for the great talk. I have one question in particular. It's about the VPP apps. So it sounded like it was not distinguishable by the first sight if an app was a VPP app or like a self-packaged app by Kandji. I just wanted to reassure if that is the case, so you cannot distinguish like between, okay, this comes from Apple, from VPP, and this app is just like a package that Kandji installs. Is that correct?
In Kandji, you can tell, it's hard to remember now, but in Kandji have auto apps. And then I think they might have just called it Mac apps, but they did separate that out. Auto apps is what they were trying to move to, but the problem for us was that we already had so many Slack and Microsoft 365 deployed as VPP apps. And I think ideally what I probably would have wanted to have done is moved people to the non-VPP app whilst we were still in Kandji to get that out of the way before we moved. But yeah, that's not something that we did in the end.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you. Great talk.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you got it.
I'm Mark. Hi. I'm really curious about the file vault bug that you had because I ran a migration myself not too long ago, and it definitely wasn't a US keyboard problem, at least not for every problem, every key that I couldn't re-escrow. Did you get any more information, or do you have any more suspicions about why that fails? Is it really just too fast of a timeout by default?
Oh, in terms of having to change the timeout for the file vault re-escrow part, you mean, or do you mean the keyboard issue? Right.
So Jamf Migrate was in beta and was just a bunch of bash scripts when I did this. So I had a lot of like manual stuff to do, and the symptom I observed for about 5% of the people who migrated is just that the last thing, escrow the file vault key, failed. It just failed. And the whole thing, and so the users think something's gone terribly wrong. And it's true, you don't get the recovery key if the escrow fails, but everything else is fine. You're managed, right? And I could never figure out how to make it better, how to make, fewer than 5% fail at this stage. And I know for a fact it wasn't a keyboard bug. I wondered if there was anything else you learned about.
Yeah, so it sounds like it was the first issue that I mentioned where, like in our case, because the timeout for the tool was so low, what we were finding was that the new file vault payload needed to be present on the Mac before Jamf Migrate timed out on that section. Otherwise, it would just go, well, the profile's not here, I'm just going to move on, which is what we were seeing with those failures. So that's why extending the timeout worked for us because it just gave it more time to wait for the profile to come down. It may also be to do with how many profiles we had. I'm not sure, but like I mentioned, in most cases the profiles came down in seconds, but in some cases I was just sitting there for minutes waiting. Now I could have set the timeout to like an hour if I really wanted to, because after 5 minutes, like I'm pretty sure that every case that I tested with, it always came down by then. But I didn't want to leave it that long just in case there was someone where it just refused to come down and they were sitting there for an hour and were like, oh, I'm just going to turn my computer off. Or
Yeah.
So yeah, 5 minutes was the sweet spot that I found, but your mileage may vary.
That's so interesting. I still, like in my heart of hearts, think something else was happening, but I don't know what.
It took me a while to figure it out.
Did you use Kandji Passport, and are you using Jamf Connect right now?
No, and no. No, we're using we're using just a normal password for the Mac login, and we're using Okta SSO. The reason that I wouldn't want to move to something like Jamf Connect personally is because for better or for worse, we have a password rotation policy every 90 days, and I don't want to get into a situation where users have recently reset their password, but they're unable to log into their Mac because they don't know whether it's the new one or whether it's still the old one. So yeah, ideally I'd probably prefer not to have a password rotation policy, but yeah, it is what it is.
All right, do we have any other questions? We still have about 9 minutes. Coming to you.
So this is totally probably like tangential to the topic, but I'm so curious about how Kandji, and you sort of touched on it a little bit, about how Kandji manages to get dynamic scoping or dynamic application of policies installations without a function like extension attributes and smart groups. What are some of the workarounds?
Well, like for us, there just wasn't. Like in the example that I used of trying to dynamically apply settings to people that were or were not signed into an iCloud account, it was a case of exporting a static list of serial numbers and then deploying the settings just to those serial numbers and then manually updating. It was really time consuming. From my understanding, Kandji have recently released something called, I think it's called assignment maps, where they're trying to get, I think, closer to that. But I can only speak from the experience I had whilst we were using it, and that didn't exist. And it was really painful trying to dynamically apply things like that. Yeah.
I can share some perspective on the assignment maps. They are trying to encourage some dynamic grouping, but it's still subject to the 14 or so categories that they have available. So there's not a lot of options in terms of nuance. Yeah, coming to you.
On the same question, is that you guys, or can anyone answer, is Mosile or Fleet similar to that as well, where they're missing that function of a dynamic grouping? Intune is like that, right? You only get a little bit of functions for dynamic user and dynamic, I think it's device, but the number of fields that you can select are very limited too.
So far I've only used VMware Workspace ONE, Kandji, and Jamf Pro. So I've not used those MDMs, but maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, the Mosel one is a little difficult because they don't have public support documentation. So in terms of doing research on that, it's a little rough. But as I understand it, Jamf Smart Groups is a patented technology for Jamf. And so when it comes to other competitors attempting to accomplish similar dynamic grouping, they're just unable to because they can't create the technology around it. From a Mosel perspective, I understand that their reporting is very, very limited. So I have to assume that it follows the same, methodology that Kandji does. What was the other one that you mentioned? Fleet? Fleet is fairly new. As I understand, they were open source, and now they're starting to offer a first-party tool. So we haven't done much research, but maybe sometime in the future we'll have some more information on that.
It would be great to have a session for next year of comparative features for all so limited, and a lot of managers don't understand the limitations.
Yeah. So funny enough, I lead our competitive intelligence efforts at Jamf, and so our sellers are equipped with tools that they can share with you that are shareable to your executive team that cover off on all the differences in capabilities that help deliver on those benefits. But number one pain point for Intune is the check-in time. It's an 8-hour window, so it's like a guessing game on when it'll get there.
Do you think you will adopt the new blueprint from Jamf?
That's definitely something that I'm going to look into, yeah, because especially from my understanding, it's heavily focused around DDM rather than MDM. I mean, I've already touched on why MDM is not always a great solution. It doesn't always work flawlessly like we expect it to, and that's because of the kind of the unnecessary complexity in the communication between the Mac and APNS and Jamf Pro, which DDM simplifies a lot. So yeah, I'm definitely going to be looking into that for sure.
Thanks. You touched on this a little bit, but I'm just curious, when you decided to move away from Kandji, the research process, how much went into that in terms of picking Jamf? And maybe what were some of the key considerations that ultimately led you to choose Jamf?
So I actually wasn't too heavily involved in that process. That was beforehand. That was a decision that was taken up by leadership, and then was given to me to kind of look after the migration process. So I can't really speak too much to that process, but I know that one of the biggest reasons was the cost. Kandji up in their prices and made Jamf a lot more financially competitive. And for me, just kind of speaking personally in the values that I found from it, which was features like smart groups and extension attributes. But yeah, the decision process I wasn't really too involved in beforehand.
You mentioned the 3% failure rate with the MDM side of things. Was there anything offered after the fact for preventing that beforehand? Like, was there any preventative measures that could have been taken to avoid that 3%? Or is that just like expect about 3% of your migration to require that re-enrollment script after the fact?
No, I had a look I had to look to see if there was anything that those Macs had in common, some reason that caused it. I couldn't find anything. It just seemed to be completely random. From what Jamf described, they seemed to kind of point to it being some kind of issue with Apple and their servers. But no, never kind of really got an answer on that. And once the migration was finished, it was kind of nothing that we needed to worry about at that stage. But yeah, from the list of Macs that I collected that had the issue, it was about 3%, but totally sporadic, totally random. The only thing that we could do is account for it, like I say, once we found them and then action it after the fact. But for us, it was low enough that it wasn't a major issue. Like considering that we did the migration over a span of a few weeks, several weeks, the majority of the people, it happened probably like once or twice a day. So for 550 Macs, it wasn't too much of an issue, really.
Great. We have time for about one more question, or we can give you a minute or two back to head to your next session. Any final thoughts? Great. Well, thank you so much, Aiden. If folks have questions for you, where can they find you throughout the rest of JNUC?
Thanks. And if anyone wants to hit me up on Slack, I'm at Aiden on Slack. I was lucky enough to be the first Aiden in the Mac admins Slack workspace. So yeah, feel free to hit me up.
Great job. Thank you, Aiden. Thanks, y'all. Enjoy the rest of the conference.